Respected Shri Rajmohan Gandhi and friends, warm welcome from Bhavan Gandhi's Sangrahalaya and Gandhi's Smarak Nidhi, Mumbai to Bhavan, the house hallowed by Gandhiji's presence. We are very happy to have with us Shri Rajmohan Gandhi today on the Human Rights Day for an online lecture to mark the centenaries of the non-cooperation movement and the National Week. The topic of his lecture is When India Changed, the story from Jallianwala to Chauri Chaura 1919-22. We are looking forward to hear you, Rajmohan Bhai, and request you to deliver your lecture. Thank you. Rajmohan Bhai, please.
Thank you, Shaben. Thank you for your welcome. And I'm very happy indeed that I am virtually in Bhavan again, where I have done a certain amount of research. So I'm extremely happy to make this connection again. I'm speaking at the moment from Urbana, Illinois, United States. But I'm very happy that I'll be able to have this conversation or give my talk to several people. Now, mine will be a chronological story from 1919 to 1922. The story contains interesting features, which I hope that some of you will be able to notice. One feature is that some inspired ideas came forward at this time. And then some amazing people emerged. Amazing people who gambled with their lives and then became leaders, and in many cases loved leaders. Another feature that emerges from this story is that there was a frank and public debate between some of the greatly loved figures. Another feature of that period from 1919 to 1922 is that there was an awakening in many suppressed groups. And it was across the board, many suppressed groups also found an awakening at that time. There was also, of course, quite a remarkable and courageous leadership. And finally, something new emerged for the world as a whole as a result of those 3 years, 1919 to 1922. Now, I'll give you the background to this period. I'm giving a kind of a historical overview of those 3 years, but let us notice the background when our period starts. So first of all, there was the 1857 movement, which was quite an astonishing movement, but it was suppressed, as everybody knows. So the post-1857 British policy, the empire's policy, was, above all, the foundation of that policy was that Hindus and Muslims of India should remain divided. So that was the foundational principle of imperial policy after 1857. As a result of that policy, in 1909, a separate Muslim electorate was created. Many Muslim leaders made a demand for it, but it was something that the empire has encouraged and elicited this demand. And in 1909, this demand was conceded, and there were separate Muslim electorates. Of course, at that time, elections were only held for local bodies and some relatively politically not so important, but still the granting of the Muslim electorate was an important element in British imperial policy. Then World War I came in 1914. And a very important feature of that World War I was that England and France were on one side, and Germany was on the other side, but Germany had an important ally, Turkey. And this was very important because at that time, Turkey was the biggest Muslim power in the world. And many Muslims across the world, including in India, and when I say India, 14, World War I, the India I'm speaking of is the united India, the undivided India. So Karachi is part of India, Dhaka is part of India, Peshawar is part of India at this time. And there are Muslims in all parts of this undivided India. And so when Turkey and Germany are on one side and England and France are on the other side, and England is ruling over India, and many Indian soldiers recruit for the British side and many fight for the British side, the empire side in World War I. But on the other side is Turkey, which is the world's biggest Muslim power at the time. And so this makes it very tricky for many Muslims in India, including many Muslims who joined the British Army. So as a result of this tricky situation, something important happened in 1916, which also people should be aware of. Gandhiji had arrived by this time in India from South Africa, but there were many other political leaders, very famous and powerful leaders who were in India at this time, both in the Congress and in the Muslim League. So in 1916, the Lucknow Pact was reached between the Congress and the Muslim League. So this pact was the work of the achievement of many people, but in particular 3 people. Lokmanya Tilak was a very leading, you might say, founder of this pact. So was Annie Besant, and so was Muhammad Ali Jinnah. So these 3 and some others together fashioned the Lucknow Pact between the Muslim League and the Congress for self-government in India. They didn't speak at that time of independence, but towards self-government. And through this pact, the Congress accepted the separate Muslim electorates. Now in 1917, one of Gandhi's Satyagrahas, the Champara Satyagraha in Bihar, which was a very major event that took place. Now, by 1919, the British had put forward policies for councils, for provincial councils, and that Indians could contest elections for these councils. The councils would not have too much power, they would have some power. The British would have most of the power, but elected Indians in the councils would have some power at the provincial level. So this was an interesting response from the British to encourage Indian participation, including in the World War, of course, which ended in 1918. And then thereafter, there was this response from the British to the Indian demands for self-government, a partial response, not a very satisfactory response, but a partial response. But then at the beginning of 1919 came the Rowlatt Act. Rowlatt Act, named after a jurist judge called Sidney Rowlatt. And at this time, this British Empire's officials felt that this movement for freedom was becoming strong in India, and that perhaps the Germans, although Germany was defeated by this time, and the Russians, Soviet Revolution had taken place in 1917, that the Germans and Russians might also intervene, and that there might be extremists and terrorists in India. So therefore, they created the Rowlatt Act to suppress free speech. This was directed at newspapers, periodicals, even people producing a pamphlet were subject to be scrutinized, and anything that was anti-British was regarded as dangerous, was regarded as terroristic, was regarded as extremist, was regarded as foreign influenced. So it was an attack on free speech. So this is where Gandhi makes his first national intervention. Champaran was very significant, and it had an impact all across India. but it was limited, of course, to Bihar. It was a successful Satyagraha. So in 1919, when the Rowlatt Act comes into being, Gandhi then proposes two things. He says we must be ready with Satyagraha on a nationwide scale. And he also says we should have a nationwide hartal. And the response to Gandhi's call was quite extraordinary all across India. And in many ways, this was the first nationwide political movement. There had been other significant political movements in different parts of India, but the nationwide hartal against the Rowlatt Act and the willingness of groups of people to offer Satyagraha all across India in 1919 was, in a way, the first really nationwide political activity. Now, I will tell the story of what happens from this time, 1919, Rowlatt Act Satyagraha Hartal, to 1922. But I want to inform those who are hearing me of what my perspectives are, or how my perspectives have been shaped for this. Now, some of the books that I have written have been on aspects of this period, 1919 to 1922. I wrote my Rajaji biography, which also covers this period. Then I wrote my Sardar Patel biography, which also covers this period. Then I wrote my Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan biography, which also includes a survey of this period and how Badshah Khan was related to these events. Then I wrote my Gandhi biography in 2006, which also, of course, covers, among other things, this period. Then I also wrote in 2012 and 13 a history of undivided Punjab from the death of Aurangzeb to the partition of 1947. So there also I went into the background of the story of Punjab. And so my understanding of what happened in 1919, 1922 is influenced by all the research I did for all these biographies. And I also looked at the imperial perspective. I looked at what would later become the Pakistani perspective. Of course, Pakistan was not even thought of at this time, but there were the areas which later became part of Pakistan were involved in this story. So I looked at Pakistani perspectives, a Sikh perspective, imperial perspectives, Muslim Punjabis. Of course, Muslim Punjabis are even today a lot more numerous than Hindu Punjabis or Sikh Punjabis. Punjabi speakers are above all today to be found in Pakistan, in the province of Punjab, although of course there are many Hindu and Sikh Punjabis in India and around the world, but Muslim Punjabis who speak Punjabi even more numerous. So I give this background so that you can understand the perspectives that I've tried to understand and incorporate in my study of this period, but it's inevitable. History is so vast, so detailed, so rich, so many people are involved that there are many perspectives which will be missing in my analysis. So I would like other people, when they continue, if they're interested in this period, to do their own further research and add some new perspectives. But I will, of course, speak from my perspectives. So when the nationwide hartal took place, and that Satyagraha Sabhas were formed in various places, during that nationwide hartal, the Hindus and Muslims joined together in different parts of India, in Bombay also, in Delhi, in Punjab, elsewhere. So there was a great excitement that there will be Satyagraha against the Rowlatt Act. But there's also anxiety, will there be violence? And so there were these two very remarkable people in Amritsar at the time, Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal. Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu was a barrister. He was also a philosophy PhD. Dr. Satyapal was a medical doctor. He had also served in Aden, in the Gulf area. So these two, Dr. Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal, they organized Satyagrahas in Amritsar. But because they also wanted to avert any violence, and they felt that Gandhiji should be invited to Punjab so that he could guide this Satyagraha against the Rowlatt Act. But the British authorities didn't allow Gandhi to enter Punjab. Before his train from Bombay or Mumbai reached Palwal station, not far from Punjab, now of course close to Haryana, but then it was all of Punjab, even Haryana was part of one Punjab. So before the train reached Palwal station, Gandhi was given a written notice that he should not proceed to Punjab. He was told that he would disturb the peace in Punjab. So Gandhi said that he is going to preserve the peace. So this is an important point to remember, that Gandhi by this time is saying to the British and to the Indian people that preserving peace, maintaining unity is our job. We Indians can do it. The empire doesn't have to do it. I will go to Punjab and the Satyagraha will be a non-violent, peaceful Satyagraha for free speech, but I will maintain peace. But he was not allowed to enter Punjab. He was removed. Not only was, how was he removed? At Palwal station, he was taken off the train. He was sent to Mathura. And then he was sent back to Bombay on a goods train, on a Malgadi with Mahadev Desai. And then in Amritsar, Dr. Satyapal and Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu were both arrested. So the fact that Gandhi was not allowed to enter Punjab, and that these two very popular leaders of Amritsar, Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal, were arrested, created tremendous unrest in Amritsar. And then also, of course, Gandhi now is on his way back towards Bombay. But there is this fact that Gandhi is not allowed, that he is sent back, and these leaders in Amritsar, and there were some others in Lahore also who were arrested, created activity across India. And in Ahmedabad, there was violent activity. So when Gandhi returns to Bombay, and there is some disturbance in Bombay also, Gandhi meets the police commissioner, and they meet Gandhi, and they blame Gandhi for the violence. And Gandhi says, I want to know all the facts. So Gandhi was told that 2 or 3 Europeans had been killed in Ahmedabad. The telegraph office, collector's office, railway station had been burnt down. Several Indians had been killed in police firing. And then there was a story spread in Ahmedabad that Anasuya Sarabhai, who was one of Gandhi's close associates, who was a sister of Ambalal Sarabhai, and Ambalal Sarabhai was this big mill owner, but Anasuya Sarabhai, his sister, was a leader of the labor union. And she and Gandhi were working closely together. But there was a rumor in Ahmedabad that Anasuya Ben Sarabhai has been arrested, so that also created more unrest, more violence. So Gandhi is attacked by the British officers. They say, see, you are doing this and violence is taking place. And he was told that, although details were not available, he was told that there's also violence in Punjab. So Gandhi said, if violence takes place, then I may have to suspend my Satyagraha. So then he goes from Bombay to Ahmedabad, because he's been told that there is violence in Ahmedabad. And Gandhi finds when he reaches Ahmedabad, this is April 12 of 1919, that yes, there is violence. And so Gandhi wants to tackle this violence head on. So he says to the British who want to impose martial law, and Gandhi says, no, I will control the violence. This is also worth interesting. This is the height of the empire. Gandhi tells the British authorities, you can't control India, I can, or the people of India can. So he addresses a big public meeting near the ashram on April 13 in Ahmedabad. But Gandhi is not well, he's tired. So he asks Vallabhbhai Patel to deliver this speech. Why does he ask Vallabhbhai Patel to deliver this speech? Because he wants everybody to know that Vallabhbhai Patel also shares the sentiments that Gandhi is expressing in his speech. So this is what Gandhi said in his speech, which was read out by Vallabhbhai Patel. Brothers, I'm ashamed of the events of the last few days. Those responsible have disgraced me. In the name of Satyagraha, we have burned down buildings, forcibly captured weapons, extorted money, stopped trains, cut off telegraph wires, killed innocent people, plundered shops and homes. A most brutal rumor was set afloat that Anasuya-Ben was arrested. Under the cloak of her arrest, terrible deeds have been done. We should repent and do penance. I would advise you, if possible for you, to fast for 24 hours, at least in slight expiation of these sins. But because my responsibility is much greater, I will fast for 3 days, for 72 hours. Then he makes this very interesting statement. If a redress of grievances is only possible by means of hatred of English people and of slaughter of English people, I, for one, will do even without Swaraj and without redress. Now, this speech Gandhi makes through Vallabhbhai Patel in Ahmedabad. But meanwhile, already in Jallianwala, this massacre has taken place. But because of censorship and because telegraph wires have been cut, the news has not reached other parts of India. It's hard for people today to imagine that this terrible violence occurs in Jallianwala, but most of India remains absolutely unaware of what had happened there. So now, before the violence occurred in Amritsar on 13th of April of, the first violence occurred on the 10th of April, which was when Indian demonstrators, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, demonstrated against the Rowlatt Act, saying Mahatma Gandhi Zindabad. So they had also created some violence, and 5 Englishmen had actually been killed, and 1 English woman who was a teacher, she had been attacked. This was a very unfortunate and sad development on 10th of April of 1919. Now, Gandhi was, of course, not aware of all this when he was still in Ahmedabad. He was tackling the violence in Ahmedabad. And he was not aware also of what the reaction was taking place. Now, in Punjab, there was this governor called Michael O'Dwyer. So Michael O'Dwyer was a very tough governor of Punjab. People have heard of Brigadier Dyer, who led the attack in Amritsar on April 13, 1919. But even more influential for setting the imperial policy at the time, the policy of toughness, the policy of using harsh violence against demonstrators, was the policy of the governor, Michael O'Dwyer. And much of this policy, the details of how it was executed, is available in a book that Michael O'Dwyer himself wrote a few years thereafter when he left India. So some of this information that other scholars and I too have obtained is from Michael O'Dwyer's own book. Now O'Dwyer claimed that the interests of the rural masses of Punjab required him to resist political reform. To him, representative government, such something like what the 1919 reforms were introducing, O'Dwyer felt was terrible, was a terrible mistake. And Punjabis with political aspirations, city Punjabis, were untrustworthy and particularly objectionable from the point of view of men like O'Dwyer was any agitation that brought Hindus and Muslims together. As the empire saw it and as O'Dwyer saw it, Hindu-Muslim question was a subject for the empire, not for Indians, but Gandhi felt it was a subject for Indians. So So there were Satyagrahas and demonstrations in Lahore and in Amritsar. And then this unfortunate violence took place on the 10th of April. Then on the 13th of April, that is when we all know what happened in Amritsar. But the details are also worth noting. So in the heart of Amritsar was this ground called Jallianwala Bagh. Three sides were walls or buildings. And it was Sunday, 13th April, Baisakhi Day. It's always Baisakhi Day is 13th of April. And about 10,000 people, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs had gathered at Jallianwala Bagh. And they were responding to a call from city leaders. Some were very unhappy that Kichlu and Satyapal had been jailed. Gandhi was not allowed in. And they were also unhappy that there was a ban on meetings. Anyway, and others also attended the meeting, did not even know that there was a ban. So the gathering were all listening to a speaker when at about 4:30 p.m., Brigadier Dyer arrived with, this is his own report, which I obtained from papers, Dyer's own report the next day, that he had 50 rifle-carrying troops, Gurkhas, Sikhs, and Muslims. 50 rifle-carrying troops and 40 additional Gurkhas were armed with kukris. So with 50 rifle-carrying soldiers and with 40 additional Gurkhas were armed with these swords, he arrived. And they occupied the entrance to the ground, which was also the only exit from the ground. And immediately Dyer ordered firing. So he didn't say, leave, I want you to disperse. Before ordering the crowd to disperse, he just started firing at this crowd. So for 10 continuous minutes, the Indian soldiers of the empire obediently pulled their triggers, and they only stopped when the ammunition ran out. Every bullet found a victim. And going by Dyer's own report, 1,650 rounds were fired. And as soon as the firing ended, curfew was imposed. And according to Dyer himself, the city became, in his words, absolutely quiet. In his words, not a soul could be seen. And as somebody else wrote, the dead of Jallianwala Bagh and the dying in Jallianwala Bagh spent the night alone with dogs and vultures. So now this is Amritsar, and Odwaya, the governor, is in Lahore. So word reaches him that something is happening in Amritsar, but word reaches him in that excited time. It is a very misleading report. So two British officials, these are from the papers of Odwaya and Dyer, they arrive in Amritsar, two British officials, and they say that Dyer's troops had killed about 200. Actually, of course, many more were killed. And according to this, these two Englishmen who did not have enough information, they told Governor Odwaya that the Indian troops had refused to fire. And so Odwaya became even tougher and angrier. And so Odwaya then sent a message to Dyer in Amritsar saying that he must remain absolutely tough. Your action was correct. The governor approves of your action. And so after this, the water and electricity in Amritsar is cut off by Dyer. And he imposes this notorious crawling order so that all those who use the lane where this English woman, Miss Sherwood, had been attacked, they should crawl on their bellies for 200 yards, that they could not walk on this lane. They had to crawl on these bellies. Every Indian who intended to use that lane had to crawl on his belly or her belly for 200 yards. So, and censorship was imposed, martial law was imposed, and India did not know for several days what had happened in Amritsar. Because the official figures were that 379 were killed and over 1,000 injured, but actual numbers were probably much higher. So then there were air attacks and Royal Air Force aircraft hit Muslim, Sikhs, and Hindus from the air with bombs and machine guns after the demonstrators had dispersed. And various punishments to students in colleges of Punjab. Students had to walk 17 miles a day to keep reporting to military authorities. So a non-existent revolutionary plot. The O'Dwyer thought that there was some kind of 1857 type rebellion taking place, which was not happening. And therefore these martial law and these strict orders. Of course, Gandhi halted his Satyagraha. But the empire's reputation was in tatters after the Amritsar massacre became known. O'Dwyer and Dyer were both obliged to return to Britain, but they remained unrepentant. And their supporters in Britain honored them. And Brigadier Dyer was given money by the House of Lords. He was given a sword by his admirers that he was saving British lives. So this was one event, a big event. So there is the Rowlatt Act, there is the Hartal, there are the Satyagraha, there are the demonstrations, there is violence, there is Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and Gandhi suspends his Satyagraha for the time being. Now the empire was, of course, not yet defeated. The rifle was not the empire's only weapon. While army openings continued to attract peasants in Punjab and elsewhere, the Raj could also dangle jobs before the educated unemployed. They could dangle councils before the ambitious politicians. And they could dangle titles, various titles the empire could offer to the rich people or the vain people who wanted titles. So this is the story of 1919. And by the time 1919 ends and 1920 arrives, and meanwhile, people are very unhappy about the massacre. All of India is terribly unhappy about the massacre, but something else is happening. The Muslims of undivided India are also very unhappy about the way Turkey is being treated. The war is over, Germany is defeated, Turkey is defeated, and the victorious powers in Europe, England and France, they have control over all the areas that Turkey had controlled, including today's Saudi Arabia, including Makkah and Medina, including Najaf and Karbala. So Najaf and Karbala are in today's Iraq. Makkah and Medina are in today's Saudi Arabia. They were then ruled by Turkey, but now Britain and France were in charge of these areas. So many Muslims all over the world thought, including in undivided India, that now these Europeans who are not Muslims, they will be controlling these holy places, Makkah, Medina, Karbala, and Najaf. And so there is tremendous unhappiness among the Muslims of India, undivided India. So this is where Gandhi sees that there's a tremendous opportunity to intensify, extend, deepen the freedom movement. The Hindus are unhappy, Sikhs are unhappy because of the massacre. The Muslims are unhappy. And of course, Gandhi, from the very beginning, even before all this, from the moment he arrives in 1915 from South Africa, his plan is not only to organize satyagrahas to defeat the empire, he also wants to create Hindu-Muslim unity. He also wants to end the high and low. He wants to create a new relationship between the so-called high caste and the so-called low caste, the so-called untouchables. He called them the Harijans, now we call them Dalits. He wanted to bridge that caste divide. He wanted to bridge the communal divide. So now as Hindus are unhappy, Muslims are unhappy, Sikhs are unhappy, so Gandhi gets the feeling that now is a time to mobilize all of India for a huge independence movement. And that is where the idea of non-cooperation occurs to him. Non-cooperation. This was Gandhi's idea, that the empire is able to rule because we are cooperating with them. Gandhi had written that in Hind Swaraj, but now he has a practical opportunity to urge the Indian people to non-cooperate. Muslims can non-cooperate, Sikhs can non-cooperate, Hindus can non-cooperate, Dalits can non-cooperate, upper caste can non-cooperate. So this is when, again, India is mobilized throughout 1920 and throughout 1921, and the non-cooperation movement is launched. And the interesting thing that happens is now, Vallabhbhai Patel had joined Gandhi even before Rowlatt Act in 1918. Rajgopalachari had joined him in 1919 after the Rowlatt Act. He becomes his ally. Kripalani and Rajendra Prasad had joined him from the Champaran time, 1917. But now, in 1920, look at the people who joined Gandhi and become his comrades. There is Maulana Azad. There is Dr. Zakir Hussain, Dr. M.A. Ansari, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan from the province, and Jawaharlal Nehru. And who joins him? Subhash Bose. Subhash Bose was studying in England, but he joins the movement in India. So this, and then, so Maulana Azad joins him, or joins the non-cooperation movement. And he is in Patna and he gives a talk. It's 1920. There's a young man who listens to the talk. His name is Jayaprakash Narayan, and he throws his life also into the movement. And there were many others. There were, of course, some well-established leaders already, like Motilal Nehru, C.R. Das. But they become radicalized and they become revolutionized. They change their lifestyle. They start wearing khadi, they start spinning the charkha, they are willing to go to prison, they are willing to do things they had never thought before. These were aristocratic people, successful, prominent people who were successful in the British Empire-run India. But they are radicalized and revolutionized. But this is something that is worth noting, is the emergence of a team of new leaders, young leaders who joined Gandhi. And the other interesting thing, which I'm going to anticipate this a bit, that most of these leaders stayed together. They often had differences, but they stayed together as friends. They became brothers and sisters for life, for India's freedom. This is also worth noting. And one other thing worth noting is that when there was a non-cooperation movement and the people were arrested, many thousands and thousands of people were arrested non-violently. They were protesting non-violently, they were arrested. And Gandhi was always thrilled when arrests took place. And when he heard that the wife of C.R. Das, Basanti Devi, and other women in Bengal had also courted arrest, this is 1921, Gandhi, according to some observer who was with him, a man called Krishna Das, he looked like a child brimming over with sheer joy. His whole frame seemed to be tingling with joy, and he appeared to sway with delight as he walked. So the fact that the women of India were willing to sacrifice, willing to go to prison, so Gandhi felt, agar aisa ho sakta hai, to ab to azadi aane hi wali hai. So he was inspired with this. So women were entering the battle, not only entering public life, they were willing to go to prison. Distinguished women had conquered the fear of jail. Risking their jobs, thousands of men had non-violently defied the empire. So in spirit, at least, Swaraj had arrived. And another thing worth noting is that his Harilal Gandhi, Gandhi's eldest son, also joined the non-cooperation movement in Calcutta. He was arrested on December 10, today's date. So very pleased Gandhi at once sent a wire to Harilal expressing his satisfaction. And Kasturba also was happy. And she said, I've also done 3 months hard labor in South Africa, she said. Something else worth noting is, I've already mentioned that suppressed classes saw an awakening. Now, in 1920, when non-cooperation was adopted as a policy by the Congress simultaneously passed a resolution that the removal of untouchability would become part of the political program of the Congress for the first time. The removal of untouchability became a part of the political program. Thus far, it was regarded as a social issue, but it became a political issue from 1920. And here I may just jump forward for a few seconds. Those who have read the story of the caste system and of Baba Sahib Ambedkar know that the Mahad Satyagraha of 1927 was a very big event. When he organized the Mahads in the place called Mahad in Maharashtra for the right to use water, which was given only to caste Hindus and not to the Dalits. So Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar organized this Satyagraha in Mahad in 1927, but he called it a Satyagraha. So now we all know of the very sharp differences between Ambedkar and Gandhi in the years to come. We also know that there was a partnership also in the years to come. But it is worth noting that because there was this awakening everywhere, all across the Indian population, including among the Dalits, Ambedkar not only had a portrait of Gandhi during this Mahad Satyagraha, where the Satyagrahis were performing their Satyagraha, he called his struggle a Satyagraha at that time, which is also worth noting. Now, I've mentioned that there were disagreements and debates. And the most famous debate, and most scholars know this, was between Tagore and Gandhi. And Tagore wrote in a journal called Modern Review, which was being published in Calcutta. And Gandhi published his answers in his journal, Young India, in Ahmedabad. And all other newspapers in India published what Tagore was writing and what Gandhi was writing. So all of India was treated to this debate between Gandhi and Tagore. So Tagore urged Gandhi in one of his articles to strive to unite East and West, not merely Indians with one another, that he should unite Indians and the British, Asians in the West. And Tagore expressed disapproval of what he called the intense consciousness of the separateness of one's own people from others. So Gandhi replied to this. He replied that the aim of non-cooperation was not to create, these are his words, not to create a Chinese wall between India and the West, but to pave the way to real, honorable, and voluntary cooperation. Tagore said that he was disappointed with non as the first syllable of a great movement, non-cooperation. Why start with a negative phrase? So Gandhi pointed out that in agriculture, weeding is as important as sowing. You have to remove unhelpful weeds before you can sow. And Gandhi also pointed out that in the Upanishads, the Almighty God is described first of all as Neti, not this, not this, not this. And then these are the well-known lines of Gandhi, which many people are aware of. But what people don't know is that these lines were written by Gandhi in response to Tagore's criticism of non-cooperation. Gandhi's words in June 1921 in Young India. I hope I am as great a believer in free air as the great poet. I do not want my house to be walled in on all sides and my windows to be stuffed. I want the cultures of all the lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible. But I refuse to be blown off my feet by any, unquote. So the non-cooperation tide swept all across India. Thousands and thousands of people, their lives are transformed. they were willing to go to prison. And then there was going to be a very great Satyagraha in Bardoli, because there Gandhi and Sardar Patel and others had trained many people for a defiance, for a Satyagraha, non-violent defiance. And this was to take place sometime in February of 1922. This was supposed to be the great climax. And after that, it would spread from Bardoli to all across India. And India would then maybe become free. But then on 5th February, in Chauri Chaura, near Gorakhpur in eastern UP, an angry crowd of about 4,000 Hindus and Muslims surrounded a police party that had taken shelter in its post after exhausting its supply of ammunition. Minutes earlier, 2 people had died from the bullets of the police. Now, the police post where the policemen were sheltering themselves was burnt by angry demonstrators. And when the Indian policemen tried to run away from the fire, they were caught and they were hacked to pieces. They were cut into pieces, or they were thrown back into the flames. 22 Indian policemen lost their lives at the hands of a crowd that was shouting Mahatma Gandhi ki jai. So when 2-3 days later, Gandhi got the details of this incident, he was absolutely struck dumb. And he knew he had to withdraw everything, including the Bardoli Satyagraha, which was due on 12th February. Now, many of the Congress leaders were in prison, but many were not. So Gandhi invited those in the working committee who were not in prison to meet with him. And Gandhi met with them. And then he decided that the defiance campaign had to be suspended for the time being. And this is what he wrote: "I'm certainly the one most responsible for the crime of the people of Gorakhpur district. Yes, it had happened there, but I am responsible. But every genuine non-cooperator is also responsible. All of us should be in mourning for it. But the matter can be further discussed only when we have more details. May God save the honor of India and of non-cooperators." Now, those he consulted were not really in favor of suspension, except for a few. But Gandhi was quite clear that defiance had to be suspended for the time being. And the working committee grudgingly accepted Gandhi's decision. And there is this well-known, famous article that he wrote in Young India called "The Crime of Chauri Chaura." And claiming that God had spoken to him through the incident, Gandhi added, "But what about your manifesto to the Viceroy, your rejoinder to his reply?" Because Gandhi had said that I'm now going to do this and we'll have the Bardoli and then we will continue. It was a bitterest cup of humiliation to drink. I put my doubts and troubles before the working committee and other associates whom I found near me. They did not all agree with me at first. Some of them probably do not even now agree with me. But never has a man been blessed perhaps with colleagues and associates so considerate and so forgiving as I have. Then he continues, the drastic reversal of practically the whole of the aggressive program. He stops the aggressive program. May be politically unsound and unwise, but there is no doubt that it is religiously sound. And I venture to assure the doubters that the country will have gained by my humiliation and by my confession of error. The people of Bardoli are, in my opinion, the most peaceful in India, but Bardoli is but a speck on the map of India. The tragedy of Chauri Chaura is really the index finger. If we are not to evolve violence out of non-violence, we must hastily retrace our steps and re-establish an atmosphere of peace. Let the opponent glory in our humiliation or so-called defeat. Gandhi said, let them glory in our humiliation. Chauri Chaura must stiffen the government, must still further corrupt the police, and the reprisals that will follow must further demoralize the people. But if we learn the full lesson of the tragedy, we can turn the curse into a blessing. Of course, he went into a fast and so forth. There were other reasons also. This Chauri Chaura was not the only reason for stopping non-cooperation. Already Gandhi had heard that there was indiscipline, problems in Calcutta, in Allahabad, in Punjab, elsewhere. And there had been riots in Bombay also. So he stopped it. And of course, many were unhappy with this. But in the end, people did feel that stopping the movement at that stage was a very useful thing for the future. Now, the man who was the governor of Bombay when non-cooperation was at its height, a man called Lord Lloyd. This is what he said to a British journalist in November 1923. Gandhi gave us a scare. His program filled our jails. You can't go on arresting people forever, not when there are 320 million of them. And if they had taken the next step and refused to pay our taxes, God knows where we should have been. He continued. This was the most colossal experiment in the world's history. And it came within an inch of succeeding. But Gandhi could not control men's passions. They became violent, and he called off the program, unquote. So this was one aspect of the story. But it is also worth noting that apart from the violence that took place, which was very unfortunate, and it was a setback to the national effort, but there was also another aspect. The non-cooperation movement meant that people would give up their titles, would give up their jobs with the government, would sacrifice things. And great many people were willing to sacrifice. They left very promising careers, but then a great many people did not. Non-cooperation and sacrifice was a tough thing to ask. And although there was a tremendous response from many, so many other educated middle classes, affluent classes, they admired non-cooperation from a distance, but they were not willing to risk their careers, which were linked to the empire, dependent on the goodwill of the empire. Thousands showed great courage, but tens of thousands did not. Their reluctance to defy the empire was a human weakness, just as the violence of the people in Chauri Chaura was also a human weakness. So there were these human weaknesses that came in the way of the success, complete success of the non-cooperation movement. And I want to give one instance from a later movement, the 1942 movement. So we all know about the 42 movement, and many people know that Gandhi was arrested, and Kasturba then offered Satyagraha, and she was also arrested some days later. And then the British finally took her also and put her with Gandhi in Aga Khan Palace in Pune. So Kasturba and Sushila Nair were together arrested, and they were waiting at Bombay station to be sent on further. They were arrested, but they were there in the waiting room. And Sushila Nair, who was with Kasturba, she wrote this. Trains came and went, people came and went, station officials passed by, smoking and talking to each other. The coolies were heard haggling with the passengers. Ba had been watching this carefully. Suddenly she turned to me and said, Sushila, the world goes on as if nothing has happened. Bapu is arrested, everybody is arrested. But look at what these people are doing as if nothing has happened. How will Bapu win Swaraj? So we all know how successful the Quit India movement was. But remember, even at the height of that movement, Even when Kasturba is arrested and Bapu is in jail, everybody, Patel, Jawaharlal, everybody else is also in prison, the people continue with their daily life. And even Kasturba says, how will we win Swaraj? So this is also one aspect. So I mentioned this to indicate also what would have happened in non-cooperation movement. Many people sacrificed, but many were unwilling to sacrifice. But to return to this, the awakening that took place across the board, the Dalits, the Adivasis, the tea garden workers, Sikhs, and the people in the princely states, all of them were affected by the change. And although the Hindu-Muslim unity that occurred during the non-cooperation movement was not sustained fully, but many of the Muslims who joined the non-cooperation movement became permanent part of the Indian freedom movement. People like Dr. Ansari, people like Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, people like Abul Kalam Azad, and so many others. So although eventually Pakistan was created, but there was this incredible coming together. And last thing, so for all the shock and demoralization caused by the suspension of the non-cooperation movement, other emotions were also injured, including pride in Indian hearts and respect in British ones. As Jeffrey Ashe, English writer, says, India's leader had refused to lead his people along the old paths of bloodshed and terror and cheated hope. And the Mexican poet, the famous Nobel-winning Mexican poet, Octavio Paz, would say, in other parts of the world, violent wars for independence had often become, in his words, breeding grounds for warlords, for militarism, for coups, uprising, and civil wars. But in India, that did not happen. And eventually, India did get its independence mostly through peaceful means. And we also know that this is something new for the world. Non-violent direct action, Satyagraha, is what people like Martin Luther King and many others emulated. So with that, I end my talk.
Thank you so much, Rajmohan ji, for this very scintillating and informative talk. We have learned a lot, though we knew about few of those things, but the linkage, the background, the context you brought in, and it was wonderful. I'm absolutely sure everyone enjoyed it and everyone was educated by this talk. Thank you so much, and thanks for your wonderful participation. And I also take this opportunity to thank everybody in the Mani Bhavan family for making all this successful, and Mr. Rajesh Shinde for handling the technology aspect of it. Thank you so much. And we look forward to your further participation again and again. Because you are of course part of the Mani Bhavan family in that sense. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.